Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to the organization for inviting me. I think before we kick things off for the day, I'd love to learn a little bit more about who you are and some of the context. First of all, how many of you have heard my voice before? Okay, most of you have. How many of you are primarily crop or livestock producers? Okay. How many are primarily fruit and vegetable producers? Still a good number of those. How many of you desire to farm in an organically certifiable, compliant manner? Okay. Quite a bit fewer than I expected, considering that we're at the Organic Association of Kentucky event. So the conversation, the presentation this morning, I was asked to talk about how we think about plant nutrition and how we approach plant nutrition today versus the historical model, and what we have learned and how we should think about plant nutrition differently from what we've been taught for the last 7 decades in contemporary agriculture. So for this morning, I'm going to kick things off with a presentation for roughly an hour or so. The first session, I'm going to be talking about how we think about plant nutrition today and in the context of plant health and plant development. And then after the break, there's no presentation. It's completely open for Q&A. We can talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about. So for some important context, before we dive into this presentation, plant nutrition, and our understanding of plant nutrition has science and even mainstream scientists are finally beginning to acknowledge that there is a second model of plant nutrition that is completely different from what we've been taught for the last 70 years that is also valid. Its validity has been challenged over and over again until the last couple of decades, and now it's getting to be quite widely recognized. So what are the differences between the two? For the last 70 years, we have been taught that plants can only absorb nutrients in the form of simple ions from the soil solution. That we have calcium ions, we have nitrate ions, and potassium ions in the soil solution. In other words, this is important to point out, in other words, these ions are soluble in water, and that plants are then absorbing these soluble ions from the water solution, transporting them through roots and up into the plant and using them as a source of nutrition. So that's been the narrative for the last 70 years. However, there's been another, there's been another narrative and research supporting this second model, also going back well over 100 years, that is now entering the mainstream. And that is the idea that plants can get their nutrition not just from simple ions in the soil solution. By the way, this model of simple ions in a soil solution is possible. Plants can absorb nutrients this way. After all, that's how hydroponics works. And if we rely on that model in our agricultural systems, we're simply relying on a glorified hydroponics model. It makes no sense in an outdoor agricultural environment. The second model is the idea that plants can absorb nutrition in the form of living microbes, living bacteria, living fungi, and their microbial metabolites. In plain English, microbe poop. Plants have the capacity to absorb entire bacterial cells. And I'll be talking a little bit about some of the science behind this and the validation behind it. But the key part is that plants can in fact absorb not just 5% or 10% or 50% of their nutrition with this microbial metabolite model, but 100%. In fact, James White in his research has been identifying many of you may have seen pictures or witnessed it personally of looking at trees growing out of a hard rock outcropping. I've seen that dozens of times. There is no soil present. There are no soluble ions present. There's no soluble nitrate or calcium ions present on a hard rock face. So the question is, how does the tree get nutrition? Specifically mineral nutrition. And the answer is that in these non-domesticated plants, the plants that we call weeds, or anything that is not growing in our agricultural soils, usually get somewhere between 95 and 100% of their total nutritional requirement from bacteria, from living microbes in the soil solution. And the interesting part is that when you start deliberately managing soil so that it can deliver nutrition through biology instead of delivering nutrition through ions, there's some really interesting things that start happening. First of all, as you would expect, plant health and yields and quality improve dramatically. But secondly, the problems that you may have had in the past become the exact opposite of the problems that you have now. And I'll give one case in point. In my presentation this morning, I'm going to be framing and talking a little bit about nitrogen because I'm using nitrogen as an example for all these other elements. Usually, the expectation is that when you convert farmland to organic agriculture, and to organic farming, and you discontinue using all fertilizer inputs, you're still using manure, you're still using cover crops, but if you discontinue the use of all inputs, then the expectation is that crops are going to experience a nitrogen hit, that your soils are going to experience a nitrogen hit. And one of the biggest limiting factors to increasing yields is nitrogen. Well, since 2011, we have been using plant sap analysis on the farms that we work with. And over that time period, so this is now a decade, a bit over a decade, as we work with farms to go through this transition, we've worked now with hundreds of farms who have become organically certified or are organically certified. And the biggest challenge that we see on soils that have made this conversion to delivering nutrition through biology is that crops struggle from nitrogen excess, not from nitrogen deficiency, in organically certified systems, on organically certified farms. And in a few cases, and there's not a lot of environments in which we have this experience, but we work with a group of growers in southwest Kansas, sublet in Scott City area, Garden City area, which was the heart of the Dust Bowl 6 decades ago. And so in this, we have a very dry land environment, 12 to 15 inches of rainfall a year, sometimes less. And the historical model has been alternate year cropping once every 2 growing seasons with bare summer fallow in between to quote unquote conserve water, which is a really stupid idea. But in these environments, they believe that they don't have enough moisture, they don't have enough water to grow a cover crop, which we're demonstrating is not true. But in the meantime, we started probably 7 years ago, I think, working with this group of farmers. We now have a number of organically certified farms in this environment who do not apply manure. They do not apply compost. They do not grow cover crops because of the fallacy that they don't have enough moisture. And in that type of environment, growing corn, once every 24 months, they are experiencing nitrogen excesses. Soils that are delivering greater than 300 pounds of nitrogen for the crop every 24 months. And that is coming 100% from biology. It's not coming from manure, not coming from compost, not coming from cover crops. That is an example of what biology is capable of delivering if we unleash it and allow it to fully express itself. So with that, let's dive into this. This is my first experience projecting onto a slide or a screen from the back, and I usually use all black slides with white font, and it looks like I'm going to have to change that up. So, to give you a quick background of the context of my experience, because I think it's relevant for the conversation we want to have, so at this point, and I'm referring specifically to our consulting work at Advancing Eco-Agriculture. At this point, we work on, well, actually it's thousands of farms at this point, on about 60 different crops, mostly here in North America. We do a fair amount of work in Canada and Mexico as well as the US, but we do not do a lot of work internationally. And in the farms that we work with, we take a complete systems approach to try to understand what are all the factors that influence overall soil and plant ecosystem function. So we're really focused on crop production, not so much on livestock. Livestock are important in regenerative agricultural systems, but they're outside of our area of expertise. So when we say a complete systems approach, these are the parameters that we measure in a laboratory. We are measuring soil chemistry, soil biology, water quality, and actual absorbed plant nutrition with the use of plant sap analysis. And then we also observe how plants are expressing themselves in the field. This is actually a really big deal for us because the way that plants express themselves, their reproductive yield characteristics, this is something we've not paid enough attention to historically. You can have, I'm going to use soybeans as an example, although this is true of many crops, of most crops. So you can have a soybean plant that the same genetics, the same seed, and simply manage nutrition differently, and you can have one of those soybean plants be 48 inches tall, 50 inches tall, with nodes every 6 inches apart with 2 pods per node. Or you can plant the exact same field in the exact same soil and manage nutrition differently and have that same variety be 30 inches tall with nodes that are 2 inches apart with 6 or more pods per node. That is an expression of nutritional balance and what we call reproductive versus vegetative balance and dominance. So we also evaluate root system health and soil physical characteristics, and then very importantly, disease and insect presence. So when over the last decade of using SAP analysis very extensively, there's an interesting story of how SAP analysis came to be. That's perhaps too much to get into at the moment, but let's just say that according to the literature, according to the scientific literature, we should be able to predict disease and insect susceptibility based on plant nutritional profiles. And with the use of dry matter-based tissue analysis, we were not able to do that. That was what led us, the frustration with the inaccuracies or inconsistencies of dry matter tissue analysis led us to start using SAP analysis in 2011. And as a result of using that for the last decade, we now have several million data points that we've collected. Many of the growers that we work with, we collect samples every 14 days throughout the entire growing season because we can very clearly observe nutrient trends. And what has happened as a result of that data collection and understanding how soils deliver nutrients throughout the growing season much more accurately, we now are able to predict disease and insect susceptibility about 3 to 4 weeks into the future based on plant nutritional profiles. So I can look at a SAP analysis and I can tell you if your crop is going to be susceptible to aphids or whiteflies or spider mites or powdery mildew. And not only can we tell you that it's that there's a general susceptibility, if it's one of the crops that we have lots of experience with, we can also identify exactly which pest is likely to show up to be a problem. Is it going to be powdery mildew? Is it going to be downy mildew? Is it going to be anthracnose? We can identify that based on the plant's nutritional profile, which is incredibly powerful because if we can see that 3 to 4 weeks into the future, it now means we also have the information on how to prevent it. So I realize I'm talking a lot. I'm not going through my slides very quickly here. I need to keep moving. So in that complete integrated approach, and not all of this is relevant for all farms and for all operations, but if we're working with, particularly with high-value crops, we often are using most of these. So we'll make recommendations for soil amendments, fertilizers, inoculants, stimulants, foliars, fertigation, water quality corrections if relevant, the types of cover crops to use, cultural management practices. There's another important aspect, again, too much to get into today, but cover crops, we're at the point by evaluating and by actually measuring in a laboratory the soil's microbiome and how that microbiome changes based on cover crops, we're actually to the point where we're able to make prescription recommendations for cover crops to specifically change a soil's biology profile so that it suppresses disease. This is not something I included in the presentation this morning, but this is something else that we've learned that's so profound. There is no correlation between the presence of a disease organism in the soil and it actually causing a disease. So if you have 2 fields of watermelon and both fields have, let's say, 10,000 colony counts per gram of verticillium in the soil. If you have the exact same population of verticillium, one field can have an infection that causes disease and the next field has no disease. The only difference between the two, it's not the presence of verticillium, it is the presence or absence of other organisms that change the relationship that verticillium has with a plant. And in the last 2 years, something that I learned from Dr. James White, which we'll talk about in a bit, is that really intrigued me. My previous understanding had been that when you have the presence of these disease-suppressive organisms, they will prevent verticillium or fusarium or rhizoctone or pythium from infecting a plant root system. But Dr. White has identified that that's actually not the case. That when you have the presence of these disease-suppressive organisms, fusarium and verticillium and these quote-unquote pathogens, I'm beginning to really dislike that word, but these fungi that infect the root system will still infect, I don't like the word infect either, but let's say that they'll still penetrate the root system, but they don't cause disease. Now, they actually form a symbiotic relationship with the plant. They feed the plant nutrients. There's this exchange of nutrition exactly the same as there is with mycorrhizal fungi or other organisms. So, you can change let me say it this way. All of these quote-unquote fungal pathogens, these disease-causing organisms, can either cause disease or they can have a healthy symbiotic relationship with the plant. And the only difference between those two is the rest of the microbial community. Isn't that amazing? We need to rethink. This is one of the frustrations that I have is the challenges with the English language and the words that we use. So I'm getting to the point where I really dislike using the word pest and pathogen and weeds, because as we work with these systems, I'm increasingly coming to the realization that those definitions of pests only exists in our mind. It's something that we're creating because, at any rate, when we think about weeds, I was having a conversation once and expressing my frustrations with the challenges of language and our perception of weeds. And a colleague from Germany sent me a message and said, actually, the German word for weeds is Heilkräuter, which is healing herbs or healing plants. And I really like that because that's exactly what they are. They are healing the damage that we've done to our soils. Anyway, I need to keep moving. So I want to give you some context for the discussion as it evolved this morning on what are some of the things that I believe that others may not believe. Just differences in perspective. I think it's important to have clarity around those and what they might be. So first, I think that healthy plants can be 100% resistant to all insects and all diseases. We have quite a few Amish and Mennonites here in the community today, and the audience today, so I'm going to ask all of you a question. This is a question coming from a Christian background and perspective, but how many of you believe that the earth is cursed? All right. How many of you are afraid to raise your hands? So, one of the foundations of our success at AEA in our consulting work has been that of constantly trying to understand what are the root causes. What's the foundational cause of why do we have this challenge showing up? And so you can ask that question at different levels. You can ask the question of why does this green bean plant have whiteflies? And if you dig deeply enough and you really understand the interactions and the nutritional profiles, you can arrive at an answer of why green beans have whiteflies. That'll revolve around a changed microbiome and having too much of the wrong forms of nitrogen and not enough magnesium and sulfur, molybdenum and boron. You can develop a profile of why green beans have whiteflies. And then you can step one level back and you can ask the question, why is this field producing plants that are susceptible to whiteflies? And you get different types of answers. And then you can step back one level farther and ask the question, what is the cultural management system that we're using that is allowing whiteflies to be a consistent challenge in this overall environment, in this overall landscape? And it's a result of asking that last type of question. I started a couple of years ago, down this pathway of trying to understand we have a fundamental dilemma, dilemma is not quite the right word that I'm looking for, but at any rate, we have this dissonance, this contrast in the agricultural community at large between what we say we believe and what we actually do. So, speaking in very broad brushstrokes, the agricultural community in North America, for the most part, professes to be a Christian community. They profess to believe that we are here to be stewards of God's creation, that we are to be stewards and to take care of what has been given to us to care for. And then we behave in a way that is directly in contrast with that of being a good steward. We are severely degrading soils, we're causing pollution in the environment, the kind of list goes on and on. I don't need to go into all that. But the question is why? Why the difference between professed belief and actual practice? And it was that question of trying to understand what's the root cause of what is behind all of that. It actually led me to some very interesting places. And I've started now, so I'm going to finish. But let me just summarize it very quickly, very briefly. I think from what I understand, my perception at the moment is that there are two false beliefs, perhaps three, that are at the foundation of what allows a Christian agrarian culture to severely degrade ecosystems. The first is the belief that we are here to have dominion over. That is a clearly false belief. And you don't need to take my word for it. I invite you to go to do the research and look at it yourself. If you go into the original Hebrew of what was translated in Genesis as having dominion over, today, first of all, when it was originally translated into the word dominion hundreds of years ago, it produced a very different understanding than the word dominion today. Because dominion in the era of King James, in the era of kings and lords and nobles, dominion meant that you were to be a steward of those that were in your care. It really meant to steward. The original Hebrew word means to steward. Today, we have the understanding that dominion means to dominate and to subjugate. That was not the original intention of that at all. So I think that is the first false belief, that we are to dominate and to subjugate. The second false belief is that the earth is cursed, that we will always have thorns and thistles and brambles and diseases and insects. Only there's one little verse that we forget. It's Genesis 8:21. After Noah emerged from the ark, he offered up a burnt offering, and God said, I will never again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the thoughts and imaginations of a man's heart are evil from the days of his youth. I will never again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the thoughts and imaginations of a man's heart are evil from the days of his youth. So you think about what that means. It's a very simple question. Do you believe that verse to be true or do you not? And I was led to this as a result of, anyway, I'm getting into too many details here. The third belief, which I think is worth having a conversation about, is the belief that it's all going to burn up eventually anyway. When you combine those three, that we are to dominate, the earth is cursed, and it's all going to burn up eventually anyway, that gives Christians kind of implicit permission to damage and destroy. And from my perspective, that's a problem. Because we are really here to steward. And collectively as a society, I want to be clear, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone individually. Obviously, I don't know very many people here in the room, but I think collectively, as an agrarian culture across North America, this is one of the foundational challenges that we have to address and understand. And there's more. When you start going into the biblical perspective, I recently started having some really interesting conversations around tillage. One individual wanted to engage in a bit of a debate, saying God commanded us, we have to till the soil, we must till the soil. And I'm really fascinated by the original Hebrew, because Hebrew is such an incredibly rich language with layers and layers of meaning that cannot be fully captured in English or really in any other language for the most part. There's a few languages like that. Hebrew is one of them. And so I tried to understand what was meant by the original. And the original Hebrew word that is translated tillage is the word avad. And it occurs 270 times in the Bible. 259 times it's translated steward. and 11 times it's translated till or cultivate. So, what if it were always translated in the correct translation, or the full encapsulation is to steward? So to steward soil might sometimes mean to till, but it doesn't necessarily always mean to till. Anyway, I've wandered very far away from the original topic, haven't I? So, the reason I got into this conversation is because I do believe that healthy plants can be 100% resistant to all insects and all diseases. And that's a pretty big mouthful, that's a big claim to make, but it's one that I'm comfortable making because this is not a theory. This is not something that we think might be true at some point in the future. This is something that we have done successfully on a scale of millions of acres for the last decade on a lot of different crops. You can't produce a crop that's resistant to Japanese beetle or to Colorado potato beetle, except that we have, not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. I believe that diseases in insects do not occur at random, that they are nature's survival of the fittest mechanisms. I believe that the pathway to achieving this type of plant health is mineral nutrition and microbiology and a functional microbiome. And I've already mentioned a little bit about sap analysis and the tools that we use to evaluate how plant health is progressing through the field. Here's an example of a sap analysis report. In the consideration of time and getting into leaving lots of time for Q&A, I'm not going to get into that at the moment. At the virtual event earlier this year, I spoke a little bit about the plant health pyramid. And there's probably quite a few of you who did not listen to that presentation, but I'll give you a very quick rundown. Then I want to talk specifically about the second category because it's relevant to nitrogen. So as over the last decade, as we've worked with many different farmers, different types of crops, we have observed that crops become resistant to different types of diseases and different types of insects based on what is happening with plant physiology. The first foundational level of the plant health pyramid is when plants have effective photosynthesis and complete photosynthesis. And when this happens, there's two components here. One is that the volume of photosynthesis increases in each 24-hour photo period. You have higher production of sugars every day, and you also have the production of complete sugars, a more complex carbohydrate profile, a more complex sugar profile. And at that stage, you become resistant to all of the soil-borne fungal pathogens. So the profile that I spoke about, Fusarium, Verticillium, Rhizoctonia, Pythium, even Phytophthora, although Phytophthora is technically not a fungus, plants at this stage also will develop resistance to those fungal diseases. The second stage is when plants begin forming complete proteins. So this means that the nitrogen that's absorbed from the soil in each 24-hour photo period is rapidly converted to run through the conversion process of going to amino acids and then peptides and then complete proteins. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And that then gives them resistance to all the sucking and chewing insects. So aphids, whiteflies, leafhoppers, flea beetles, as well as all the larval insects, cabbage looper, tomato hornworm, European corn borer, corn earworm, army worm, and so forth, wireworms, are all in this category. And I'm going to dig into this because, as I mentioned, it's the context of managing nitrogen and how it relates to fertilizer and nutrition management. The third level is when plants have a surplus of energy and they store this surplus energy in the form of fats and oils. You get this glossy, waxy sheen on the leaf surface because of a high fat content. And if you are producing livestock, dairy or beef, but particularly dairy, I'm less involved with livestock and dairy production today than I was 5 or 6 years ago, but at that time when we were paying close attention to fat content of forages on a dry matter basis. And how many of you in here are livestock producers? Okay, enough that this is important to talk about. So let me say it this way. And I know that there's variability based on dairy cow genetics, but just as a general rule of thumb, once you get the common fat content in most forages that are not being optimally managed for nutrition is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2.5% to 3% fat content on a dry matter basis. You start managing nutrition really well, that'll go up to about 4 to 4.5% pretty easily. It's not that difficult to get to 4%. And when you get to 4%, is usually when we think about energy content in forages, the conversation usually revolves around carbohydrates. But in fact, you can store a tremendous amount of energy in forages with fats. So when you get up to 4%, animals will noticeably begin behaving differently. Feed consumption starts going down. Conversion efficiency starts going up. Lots of good things start happening. But then, as you increase on up, once you get to 6%, we have a number of dairies that we're working with that are 100% grass-fed dairies. And once you get to 6% fat content forages, cows do not need supplemental energy from grain. Like, there is no need for it at all. And they maintain very good body condition. And I've observed this only once. When we got forages, this wasn't 100% grass-fed, organically certified, a raw milk dairy in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, probably 8 years ago or more. And they got up to 8% fat content on their forages. And as an experiment, they decided to free choice feed grain just to see how the cows would respond to it. The cows walked past grain going into the parlor and out of the parlor 5 days and never touched it at 8% fat content forages. It's pretty remarkable. It's pretty remarkable. Anyway, then the fourth level of the plant health pyramid is when they begin forming these elevated levels of what are called plant secondary metabolites. In plain English, we call them essential oils. All plants produce these compounds, and all plants produce compounds that have antiviral properties, antifungal, antibacterial. And the simplest way to say it is that these compounds are developed by plants to kill and to protect. They have the capacity to kill insects and organisms that would cause disease, that would produce an infection. So let's go into, and it's at that stage that plants become resistant to all the insects in the beetle family. Marmorated stink bug, Japanese beetle, and so forth. All right, so we're going to go specifically into category 2, protein synthesis, and unwrap what's happening and what's going on there. Can someone give me a signal how we're doing on time? I see you looking at your watch. Oh no, not after all. 5 after 9, good. Thank you. So, looking at protein synthesis, let's talk a little bit about nitrogen utilization. I was actually expecting more members of the audience to be interested in farming organically. So I'm going to shift this up just a little bit and talk a little bit about non-organic nitrogen sources as well. So plants can absorb nutrients or nitrogen specifically. They can absorb nitrogen in 4 different forms. And these different forms are ranked in terms of plant efficiency and plant energy. You know, it's really interesting. Not all forms of nitrogen are the same or produce the same effect on a plant. We kind of implicitly know this to be true, but it's never been clearly described for most of us. We know that a pound of nitrogen is not a pound of nitrogen. Non-organic farmers might be applying, well, in the Midwest, it's commonly 200 to 300 units of nitrogen to grow a corn crop, which is ridiculous, but that's another conversation. And of course, this nitrogen is being applied in the form mostly of ammonium and nitrate. And even when it is being applied in the form of ammonium, it is often converted to nitrate before the plant absorbs it. And then one of those farms begins making the transition to organic certification. And instead of applying nitrogen in the form of liquid 28 or liquid 32 or whatever the form of N might be, they start using, first of all, they'll start using cover crops and they'll start applying manures and compost if that's available and accessible and relevant. But then if there is supplemental nitrogen needed, they might start using liquid fish, or they might start using low analysis products that might have a nitrogen content of, let's say, a 511 or something like that. And they apply that nitrogen, organic nitrogen source, but the quantity of applied nitrogen, instead of being 200 units per acre, is all of a sudden it's 50 units per acre or 80 units per acre. It's just a fraction of the original 200. And yet they're able to maintain the same yield levels as they did with the 200 pounds of non-organic nitrogen. Why the difference? Well, the difference is because of the way that plants, the energy effect that these different forms have on plants. So actually, this slide should be edited. The very top level that currently says amino acids, to be accurate, should say organic nitrogen, and or you could say microbial nitrogen. So what does that mean? In addition to amino acids, this can be amino acids, it could be amino sugars, it could be peptides, it could be enzymes, or it could be entire bacterial cells, where plants absorb an entire live bacteria into the root system and use that as an energy source. So that is that's at the top of the list. This organic nitrogen, this microbial nitrogen, is the most energy efficient form of nitrogen for plants to absorb. The second most energy efficient is urea. Third is ammonium. And urea and ammonium are fairly easy for plants to absorb, and they don't cost plants a lot of energy to convert. A little bit, but not a lot. It's very manageable. But then we get to nitrate. Nitrate, when plants absorb nitrate, it costs them a lot of energy. And by the way, most nitrogen absorption in most commercially grown crops is in the form of nitrate because of having oxidized soils. But imagine that you are building a house and you have two alternatives, two options. One option is that you can purchase a prefabricated kit where the walls and everything are already assembled and you just need to stick it together. Option B is that you need to go to a lumber yard and purchase stick lumber and put everything together from scratch. Which is going to take you the least amount of energy? Obviously, the prefab. Everything is already pre-assembled. The same concept holds true for plants when absorbing nitrogen. So if they absorb organic nitrogen, that is in the form of amino acids or amino sugars or peptides or entire bacterial cells, it is the equivalent of plants getting prefab compounds. They just take those amino acids or peptides or enzymes as they exist and incorporate them directly into the plant structure and into the plant cells. There is no further fabrication required. But there is a tremendous amount of fabrication required from nitrate. In fact, for a plant absorbing nitrate, if we go with our analogy of building a house, nitrate isn't even in the form of stick lumber. It's still a raw tree standing out in the forest that they have to go cut down and mill, and it costs the plant a tremendous amount of energy to convert nitrate into a material that it can use. In fact, the research was done on corn because corn is one of our more intensely studied plants. They say that when a corn plant absorbs 80% of its total nitrogen requirement in the form of nitrate, which is a very common scenario for corn production, it requires 16% of the plant's daily photosynthetic energy from sunlight, from sugars, just to convert nitrate into a plant-usable form of nitrogen. 16%, 1/6. That's just for nitrate. What about calcium ions and magnesium ions and all these other elements? You start adding that up, and pretty quickly, the plant has a significant energy drain. So, this is why a pound of nitrogen is not a pound of nitrogen. Organic producers, we live in a very different world today from what we did a decade ago in terms of product supply and product availability. If you use an organic amino acid form of nitrogen, there's now powdered blood meal and meat meal and corn steep liquor powder. There's a number of different organic nitrogen sources that are in the form of amino acid powders. Usually having in the powder forms will have nitrogen content somewhere in the neighborhood of 9%, or occasionally you see one as high as 11%. There's probably a dozen or more products available in the marketplace like this right now. Farmers are applying these products either as a foliar spray or to the soil at a rate of a few pounds per acre, 5 to 10 pounds per acre, and producing tremendous crop responses. So think of that, 10 pounds of a product that's 10% nitrogen. You're only applying a pound of actual nitrogen, but you're producing this huge crop response. Try that with conventional nitrogen applied in the form of nitrate. It's not going to work. You're going to get a very different response. Anyway, I'm going into too much detail here, but our experience has been that 1 pound of nitrogen in the form of amino acids is the equivalent of 4 pounds of nitrogen in the form of nitrate in terms of measured crop response and yield response. So that's just in terms of yield response, but there's also a significant difference in terms of plant health and insect resistance, which is the next piece that we want to talk about. All right, so let's talk about what happens with nitrogen inside the plant when it's absorbed. When we start with photosynthesis, the plant is absorbing carbon dioxide from the air. It's absorbing water from either the soil or from the atmosphere. And through the agency of chlorophyll and sunlight, carbon dioxide and water are combined to form a simple sugar called glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And this is important to point out. There are no minerals in sugar. There's no zinc, no manganese, no copper, magnesium, calcium. There are no minerals in sugar. It is exclusively carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And this is very important for when we talk about bacterial mineralization and what that means. I'll just get into this for just a moment so you can think about it for later. So we talk about how plant roots release sugars through the root system as root exudates to feed soil biology. So think about what I just said. They release sugars. They don't release minerals, they release sugars, and some other compounds as well, but it's mostly sugars. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen to stimulate bacteria. Yet, bacteria need minerals to form their own cells. They need magnesium, and they need zinc and manganese and copper and all these other elements. So, when they consume this sugar, they extract minerals from the soil mineral matrix that they need to form their own cells. And then, plants feed on those bacteria. And that's where they get their calcium, magnesium, zinc, manganese, copper, boron. All right, so getting back to the story here. So we have this simple sugar called glucose, C6H12O6. Imagine this as being a short chain that has 24 links in it. Bit of an oversimplification, but accurate for the purposes of description. So then, that short chain that has 24 links now gets bonded together. We're talking about proteins here. So imagine that we bond a couple of these glucose molecules together. They get rearranged and structured around, and nitrogen gets added to them. So now you have a compound. When you combine nitrogen and simple sugars, we call that an amino acid. So there are 23 common amino acids. You're all familiar with them to some degree. So these amino acids are now short chains. They might have anywhere from 18 links up to about 30 links. So they're rearranged in all types of configurations of the way that links have been moved around. Now, those short chains are bonded together in groups of 2 or 3 that we now call peptides. You may have heard of dipeptides or tripeptides. These are simply a couple of amino acids bonded together. Then those peptides are now bonded together end to end to form much longer, more complex compounds that we now call proteins, complete proteins. And proteins can be very complex molecules. You can have thousands or even tens of thousands of these peptide chains linked together. So a complete protein, some of the more complex proteins are found in animal muscle tissue, and they might have as many as 200 to 300,000 links in the chain. So we're talking about very complex compounds. Why does this matter? And why is this worth talking about? Well, it's worth talking about because the process of building these bonds inside a plant requires these compounds called enzymes. And enzymes are actually crystalline proteins. About 80% of the nitrogen in a plant is actually in the form of enzymes. So, enzymes are like an end wrench in that they move forward. There we go. Oh, missing a couple slides. All right, so enzymes are like an end wrench in that we know that an end wrench will only fit one size nut or bolt properly, and each of these enzymes can only perform one specific reaction. It can only bond amino acid A to amino acid B, nothing else. It can't bond amino acid C to amino acid Y. It doesn't have that capability. It can only perform one specific reaction. So when you think about 23 different common amino acids and all these different peptides, every time one of these bonds gets built, we need a unique enzyme to facilitate that process. Also, like end wrenches, each enzyme can perform that same task over and over and over again without being used up. There is a point to this. I'm trying to give you all the background of the story that's important here. These are examples of, this is actually an enzyme microphotograph from inside a plant tissue. I think I might have a couple more of these. Yeah, here's another one. So these are all crystalline proteins that exist inside plants. So the key, though, is that these enzymes do not function, they do not work unless they have the enzyme cofactor. So an enzyme cofactor, these enzyme cofactors are all trace mineral metal keys. So magnesium and zinc and manganese and copper, molybdenum and iodine, silver, lithium, lanthanum, titanium, and so forth. These are all, there are so far, there's still a lot of emerging research on this. But if we continue down the pathway that we're on right now, I fully expect that over the course of the next 5 years or less, we will have identified that in order for plants to have a completely functioning enzyme system, we're going to be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60 to 65 different minerals. Not 5, not 10, not 20, but 65. We now know that silver is a critical enzyme cofactor. Titanium is a critical enzyme cofactor. The list kind of goes on and on. So the only nutrient that I'm aware, or the only metal that I'm aware of that has not been identified as being an enzyme cofactor at this point is aluminum. So the point is that plants need all of these different enzyme cofactors in order for the enzymes to work. Now, so this means that if a plant is missing one of these enzyme cofactors, let's say a plant is missing cobalt, or one of the common ones that we see and address a lot is plants that are missing molybdenum. So molybdenum is the enzyme cofactor for the enzyme called the nitrate reductase enzyme. It is required by the plant to convert nitrate to amine, nitrogen, and then to amino acids. So if the plant doesn't have enough molybdenum, then that enzyme can't do its job. And you end up with a plant that has high levels of soluble nitrate in the plant sap. And we can look at that on a sap analysis and say, hey, we have high levels of nitrates, and therefore this plant is going to be susceptible to all types of insects. As I pointed out on the level 2 of the plant health pyramid, we're going to have problems with aphids and whiteflies and so forth because we have high nitrates, and we have high nitrates because we don't have enough molybdenum. All right. The reason this is worth talking about is because this process, this enzymatic process of building bonds and building reactions inside plants is exactly the same as the digestive process in our digestive process with our gut microbiome, or the digestive process of a dairy cow, or the digestive process of an insect, except in reverse. Instead of having enzymes to build all these bonds, we have enzymes in our digestive systems collectively that break down these bonds. So we start with complete proteins, we fracture the peptide to peptide bond that gives us individual peptides, and then sometimes we break down those individual peptides into individual amino acids. So we now have enzymes that break all those bonds down to the point where we have materials that are soluble enough that they can cross the gut lining and that we can use them as an energy source. Cows do the same thing, insects do the same thing. It's a universal process across all living systems. Only we know that we can't utilize the same food sources as a dairy cow can, or as a ruminant animal. Why? Because we have different enzyme systems in our digestive system. Dairy cows, ruminant animals, they have the enzyme cellulase, which allows them to get energy from cellulose, from plant material. Our digestive system doesn't have that enzyme. Therefore, a cow can consume dry hay and get energy from it, and we cannot. And there is an exact parallel to that analogy between our digestive system and the digestive system of an insect. Insects do not have, and I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes here, I know, but insects generally do not have the enzymes that are required to break the final peptide-to-peptide bond that gets used to build complete proteins. They are completely dependent. If for their protein requirements, for their nitrogen requirements, they are completely dependent on plants that have high levels of soluble nitrogen compounds like nitrate or urea or ammonium in the plant sap. And when you give plants the right nutrition, like molybdenum for the nitrate reductase enzyme, there's 4 nutrients. If you want to take notes, here's the practical application of all of this. 4 nutrients: magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum, and boron. It's those 4. When plants have enough of those 4 nutrients, you will not see these insects from level 2 in the plant health pyramid showing up in a crop. Because those 4 nutrients are the critical nutrients that are required for plants to form complete proteins and not to have any soluble nitrogen. So on a plant sap analysis, our goal on a plant sap analysis, nitrate and ammonium and total nitrogen are measured separately. So we can see each of those fractions. And our goal is to see plants that have abundant levels of total nitrogen, but have nitrate at 0 and ammonium at 0. And when that happens, you now know that you have insect resistance and you have the potential for a high-yielding crop. So I'll give you those 4 nutrients one more time. They are magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum, and boron. It's those 4. So I know that I'm running up against the clock here. I'm going to move through some of the rest of this really quickly. This is a quote from William Albrecht: "Insects are nature's garbage collectors and diseases are her cleanup crew." Here's an example of a farm that we work with in central Pennsylvania that had wireworm and rootworm in the root system that was really compromising. You can't see this clearly, but there's a small plant there on the right that was really compromised. This farm had just gone through the organic certification process, and they didn't want to spray an insecticide. They didn't know how to manage this. They had about 25% of the plants in the field being affected. And I'm missing a couple slides here. I'll go through this very quickly. The key point is that we put on a foliar application of those 4 nutrients that I mentioned, plus C-stim and C-shield product, which are what are called immune elicitors. They trigger an immune reaction by the plant. And 48 hours later, they were able to find dead wireworm and dead corn rootworm larvae in the soil. It's not an insecticide, it's nutrition. We changed the plant's nutritional profile so it no longer has any nitrates. You now have complete proteins, and you remove the food source. Think of it this way. You changed that corn plant into the equivalent of dry hay for us. They can no longer digest it. They can no longer break it down. So it killed them. And that's, again, it's one example of hundreds, thousands. This is organic corn in Kansas in 2015. Similar situation. This was in spider mites. The crop scout identified spider mites were starting to move into the field. And we did not know that spider mites were being a problem, but we had pulled a sap analysis about 5 days prior. And the consultant that was working with this farm made recommendations for nutrients to be adjusted and to be applied through the overhead pivot irrigation based on that sap analysis. So the nutrients, the pivot had started its rotation, which was a 2-day, 48-hour rotation to make it all the way around the circle, with the nutrients at the same time that the crop scout identified that mites were being present. So 48 hours after every section of each section of the pivot was treated, the spider mites were completely dead. Again, this is not an insecticide. It's simply changing nutrition. We've had many stories like this. And also that crop had no corn borer and no corn earworm, which is a significant challenge in that area. And they harvested 215 bushels of organic corn. This is aphids on lamb's quarter. And there's an interesting story behind this photo. This plant was collected. It was actually a patch of lamb's quarter that was at the intersection of a tomato field, a green bean field, and a lettuce field. Tomatoes are not particularly susceptible to aphids, but the green beans and the lettuce certainly are. There were no aphids on either the lettuce or the green beans, and the lamb's quarter was being decimated because of the changes that we've made on the soil profile. So, I think I'm going to pause there. When we come back after the break, I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we manage the transition. So if you are using lots of nitrogen inputs in the form of liquid 28 or 32 or whatever the case might be, and we want to transition to a place where we do not need those. We now have very clearly established that that is very real and very possible, particularly here in the east where we have a high rainfall environment. It's very different from dryland farming in Kansas. How do you manage that transition process? How do you work with your liquid nitrogen or your nitrogen applications to make them biologically friendly and to supply nitrogen? Our goal should be to manage our nutrition in such a way that we supply 100% of our crops' nutritional requirements in the form of biology. So that's the next piece that I'll talk about. I didn't get as far as I expected because I wandered off topic a lot. But when we get back from the break, I'm probably going to spend 10 or 15 minutes talking specifically about how to manage it, practical management, practical application, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.